Hello everyone. Very, very cool to get 10 episodes in and already have the awesome audience and listeners that I'm lucky to have. Today I have a really exciting and special episode planned for you. I'm really, really excited to share it. As you know, we're going to have our second Soundscapes of Middle-Earth reading from Shersten, and if you haven't heard the first one, basically I take a reading from one of the books from Tolkien's Legendarium, and I recreate it with layers of sound design, and I write my own music to go with it as well. Really, really fun to put these together. So Shersten is my good friend who is our narrator. She does fantastic cosplay and costume design, so be sure to check her stuff out. I'll definitely be sure to post that in the show notes. She's absolutely wonderful. I'm also really excited to be able to welcome Phil Dragash for this episode. So some of you may know of Phil, but I really have him to thank for my original real interest in Tolkien's written work. Going back to the start of my story with all of this, I saw the movies when I was younger, loved them, but I hadn't read the books. I probably had read The Hobbit, but I can't really be sure. On a random YouTube exploration, I stumbled on Phil Dragash's audiobook versions of The Lord of the Rings. Now, of course, these are not official versions and they're hard to get a hold of now, but Phil did everything. He brought the world to life. He did all the character voices, imitating very nicely a lot of the voices from the movies. He included Howard Shore's music, and he also added in his own sound effects for the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. Incredible effort and time he put into doing that. So it was because of those audiobooks that my love and joy in the stories grew, and I still listen to those audiobooks, probably more often than I care to admit. So thank you for that, Phil. When doing these episodes, I decided why not reach out to the guy and see if he might be interested in being a part of the podcast. So he agreed, and I couldn't be more excited to have him for this episode. So I'm going to let Phil introduce himself and talk a little bit about his story and what he's working on these days, and then we will jump into the reading.
Hey, everybody. My name is Phil Dragash. I think that you might know, maybe some of you might know me from doing the entire Lord of the Rings audiobook, which has sound effects and music. I called it a soundscape back in the day. I started 10 years ago. It was a huge passion of mine to do. I love making movies. I would love to be called a filmmaker, but unfortunately, it's been on hiatus for a very long time. In the meantime, I've done that audiobook, and I've also been a huge fan of Tolkien ever since the first movie came out. I've heard about Lord of the Rings when my dad went to the local library, and he rented a VHS of Ralph Bakshi's 1978 Lord of the Rings animated film, and he just said, because we were all familiar with C.S. Lewis, look, this is C.S. Lewis's friend who made this, and we're like, okay, we'll watch it. Very confusing. Didn't make much of an impact on me until the actual films came out, and when they did, I was all into it and started reading the books before the second film came out, I think, and I was ahead of everybody else, my friends, before Return of the King came out, so I knew what was going to happen, and so I'm just, ever since, I've just really loved doing it, and I feel like the world that Tolkien created is fantastic. It's very classic, and I was very happy to help out Jordan, and hopefully get to make some movies about it too.
All right, awesome. So, like I said before in the last Soundscapes of Middle-Earth episode, put your headphones on to get the full experience, and let's dive into the reading.
Now Tuor came to the ruins of a lost road, and he passed amid green mounds and leaning stones, and so came, as the day was waning, to the old hall and its high and windy courts. No shadow of fear or evil lurked there, but an awe fell upon him, thinking of those that had dwelt there and had gone. None knew whither, the proud people, deathless but doomed, from far beyond the sea. And he turned and looked, as often their eyes had looked, out across the glitter of the unquiet waters to the end of sight. Then he turned back again, and saw that the swans had alighted on the highest terrace, and stood before the west door of the hall. And they beat their wings, and it seemed to him that they beckoned for him to enter. Then Tuor went upon the wide stairs, now half hidden in thrift and campion, and he passed under the mighty lintel and entered the shadows of the house of Turgon, and he came at last to a high-pillared hall. If great it had appeared from without, now vast and wonderful it seemed to Tuor from within, and for all he wished not to awake the echoes in its emptiness. Nothing could he see there, save for at the eastern end a high seat upon a dais, and softly as he might, he paced towards it. But the sound of his feet rang upon the paved floor as the steps of doom, and echoes ran before him along the pillared aisles. As he stood before the great chair in the gloom, and saw that it was hewn of a single stone, and written with strange signs, the sinking sun drew level with the high window under the westward gable, and a shaft of light smote the wall before him, and glittered as if it were upon burnished metal. Then Tuor, marveling, saw that on the wall behind the throne there hung a shield and a great hauberk, and a helm and a long sword in a sheath. The hauberk shone as it were wrought of silver untarnished, and the sunbeam gilded it with sparks of gold. But the shield was of a strange shape to Tuor's eyes, for it was long and tapering, and its field was blue, in the midst of which was wrought an emblem of a white swan's wing. Then Tuor spoke, and his voice rang as a challenge in the roof.
By this token, I will take these arms unto myself and upon myself, whatsoever doom they bear.
And he lifted down the shield and found it light and wieldy beyond his guess, for it was wrought, it seemed, of wood, but overlaid by the craft of elven smiths with plates of metal, strong yet thin as foil, whereby it had been preserved from worm and weather. Then Tuor arrayed himself in the hauberk, and he set the helm upon his head, and he girt himself with the sword. Black were sheath and belt, with clasps of silver. Thus armed he went forth from Turgon's hall, and stood upon the high terraces of Taurus in the red light of the sun. None were there to see him, as he gazed westward, gleaming in silver and gold, and he knew not that in that hour he appeared as one of the mighty of the West, and fit to be the father of the kings of men beyond the sea, as it was indeed his doom to be. But in the taking of those arms, a change came upon Tuor, son of Huor, and his heart grew great within him. And, as he stepped down from the doors, the swans did him reverence, and plucking each a great feather from their wings, they proffered them to him, laying their long necks upon the stone before his feet. And he took the 7 feathers, and set them in the crest of his helm, and straightway the swans rose and flew north in the sunset, and Tuor saw them no more. Now Tuor felt his feet drawn to the sea strand, and he went down by long stairs to a wide shore upon the north side of Taurasnes, and as he went, he saw that the sun was sinking low into a great black cloud that came up over the rim of the darkening sea. And it grew cold, and there was a stirring and murmur as of a storm to come. And Tuor stood upon the shore, and the sun was like a smoky fire behind the menace of the sky, and it seemed to him that a great wave rose far off and rolled towards the land. But wonder held him, and he remained there unmoved. And the wave came towards him, and upon it lay a mist of shadow. Then suddenly, as it drew near, it curled and broke, and rushed forward in long arms of foam. But where it had broken, there stood it dark against the rising storm, a living shape of great height and majesty. Then Tuor bowed in reverence, for it seemed to him that he beheld a mighty king. A tall crown he wore like silver, from which his long hair fell down as foam glimmering in the dusk. And as he cast back the grey mantle that hung about him like a mist, behold, he was clad in a gleaming coat, close-fitted as the mail of a mighty fish, and in a kirtle of deep green that flashed and flickered with the sea fire, as he strode slowly towards the land. In this manner the dweller of the deep, whom the Noldor name Ulmo, Lord of Waters, showed himself to Tuor, son of Huor, of the house of Hador, beneath Venyamar. He set no foot upon the shore, but standing knee-deep in the shadowy sea, he spoke to Tuor, and then for the light of his eyes and for the sound of his deep voice, that came, as it seemed, from the foundations of the world, fell upon Tuor, and he cast himself down upon the sand.
Arise, Tuor, son of Huor. Fear not my wrath, though long have I called to thee unheard, and setting out at last thou shouldst have stood here. But now a fell winter cometh soon from the land of the enemy. Haste thou must learn, and the pleasant road I designed for thee must be changed, for my counsels have been scorned. Great evil creeps upon the valley of Sirion, and already a host of foes is come between thee and thy goal.
What then is my goal, Lord?
That which thy heart hath ever sought, to find Turgon and look upon the hidden city, for thou art arrayed thus to be my messenger. Even in the arms which long I decreed for thee. Yet now thou must under shadow pass through peril. Wrap thyself therefore in this cloak, and cast it ever aside until thou come to thy journey's end.
Then it seemed to Tuor that Ulmo parted his grey mantle, and cast to him a lappet. And as it fell about him, it was, for him, a great cloak wherein he might wrap himself over all from head to foot.
Thus thou shalt walk under my shadow. But tarry no more, for in the lands of Anar and in the fires of Melkor I will not endure. Wilt thou take up my errand?
I will, Lord.
Then I will set words in thy mouth to say unto Turgon. But first I will teach thee, and some things thou shalt hear which no man else hath heard, nay, not even the mighty among the Eldar.
And Ulmo spoke to Tuor of Valinor and its darkening, and the exile of the Noldor, and the doom of Mendos, and hiding of the blessed realm.
But behold, in the armor of fate, as the children of earth name it, there is ever a rift, and in the wars of doom a breach, until the full making which ye call the end. So it shall be while I endure, a secret voice that gainsayeth, and a light where darkness was decreed. Therefore, though in the days of this darkness I seem to oppose the will of my brethren, the lords of the West, that is my part among them, to which I was appointed ere the making of the world. Yet doom is strong, and the shadow of the enemy lengthens, and I am diminished, until in Middle-earth I am become now no more than a secret whisper. The waters that run westward wither, and their springs are poisoned, and my power withdraws from the land. For elves and men grow blind and deaf to me because of the might of Melkor, and now the curse of Mandos hastens to its fulfillment, and all the works of the Noldor shall perish, and every hope which they build shall crumble. The last hope alone is left, the hope that they have not looked for, and have not prepared, and that hope lieth in thee, for so I have chosen.
Then shall Turgon not stand against Morgoth, as all the Eldar yet hope? And what wouldst thou of me, Lord, if I come now to Turgon? For though I'm indeed willing to do as my father and stand by that king in his need, yet of little avail shall I be, a mortal man, alone, among so many and so valiant of the high folk of the West.
If I choose to send thee, Tuor, son of Huor, then believe not that thy one sword is not worth the sending. For the valor of the Edai, the elves shall ever remember as the ages lengthen, marveling as they gave life so freely, of which on earth they had so little. But it is not for thy valor only that I send thee, but to bring into the world a hope beyond thy sight, and a light that shall pierce the darkness.
And as Ulmo said these things, the mutter of the storm rose to a great cry, and the wind mounted, and the sky grew black, and the mantle of the Lord of Waters streamed out like a flying cloud.
Go now, lest the sea devour thee, for Ose obeys the will of Mandos, and he is worth being a servant of the dawn.
As thou commandest. But if I escape the doom, what words shall I say unto Turgon?
If thou come to him, then the words shall arise in thy mind, and thy mouth shall speak as I will. Speak and fear not. Thereafter do as thy heart and valor lead thee. Hold fast to my mantle, for thus shalt thou be guarded, and I will send one to thee out of the wrath of Oser, and thus shalt thou be guided. Yea, the last mariner of the last ship that shall seek into the west until the rising of the star. Go now back to the land.
Then there was a noise of thunder, and lightning flared over the sea, and Tuor beheld Ulmo standing among the waves as a tower of silver flickering with darting flames. And he cried against the wind,
I go, Lord. Yet now my heart yearneth rather to the sea.
And thereupon Ulmo lifted a mighty horn, and blew upon it a single note, to which the roaring of the storm was but a wind flaw upon a lake. And as he heard that note, and was encompassed by it, and filled with it, it seemed to Tuor that the coasts of Middle-Earth vanished, and he surveyed all the waters of the world in a great vision, from the veins of the land to the mouths of the river, and from the strands of the Eutrias out of the deep. The great sea he saw through its unquiet regions teeming with strange forms. Even to its lightless depths, in which amid the everlasting darkness there echoed voices terrible to mortal ears. Its measureless plains he surveyed with the swift sight of the Valar, lying windless upon the eye of Anar, or glittering under the horned moon, or lifted in hills of wrath that broke upon the shadowy isles, until remote upon the edge of sight, and beyond the court of leagues, he glimpsed a mountain, rising beyond his mind's reach into a shining cloud, and at its feet a long surf glimmering. And even as he strained to hear the sound of those far waves, and to see clearer that distant light, the note ended, and he stood beneath the thunder of the storm, and lightning, many-branched, rent asunder the heavens above him, and Ulmo was gone, and the sea was in tumult, and the wind and the wild waves of Ose rode against the walls of Neverest.
All right, so that brings us to the end of our reading, but don't run away yet. There's still lots to come. But thank you all for listening, and a huge special thank you to Shersten and Phil for helping make this happen. Now, before we get into the second half of this episode, as you may have noticed from the last Soundscape episode, we don't have a mid-mark, but I still got to take a chance to thank our awesome patrons. So a very big thank you to Chris in Massachusetts, Bonnie in Washington, David in Iowa, and Cameron in Texas for helping make this episode happen. So if you're interested in making this podcast grow and build, then head over to patreon.com/musicofmiddle-earth. You can find a lot of cool kind of bonuses there, and you can check out some goals for the podcast. You'll also see that one of my first goals is actually to have more than one reading in these Soundscape episodes. So with your help, we can have 2 readings and have even more content straight from Tolkien's books to share with music and sound design. And also there's a couple new things on Patreon, and one of those is actually a short bonus episode that I'm going to be releasing after every episode just for patrons. We'll dive a little deeper into some music theory concepts, so if you're super eager, you can get a little bit more info there. All right, and with all that said, time to dive into our sound design segment. Today we're going to do the sound design for the Fell Beast. That's right. Today we're talking about the sound design for the Fell Beast. Let's start with a great reading from Return of the King, the Battle of Pelennor Fields, where we get this amazing introduction to the creature. The great shadow descended like a falling cloud, and behold, it was a winged creature. If bird, then greater than all other birds, and it was naked, and neither quill nor feather did it bear. And its vast pinions were as webs of hide between horned fingers. And it stank. A creature of an older world maybe it was, whose kind, lingering in forgotten mountains cold beneath the moon, outstayed their day, and in hideous ivory bred this last untimely brood, apt to evil. And the Dark Lord took it, and nursed it with fell meats, until it grew beyond measure of all things that fly. He gave it to his servant to be his steed. Down, down it came, and then, folding its fingered webs, it gave a croaking cry, and settled upon the body of Snowmane, digging in its claws, stooping its long, naked neck. Such a vivid image, really creepy and intense. So to create the sound of these beasts in the movies, they used a combination of elements, just as they did with the Watcher in the Water that we discussed last time. So the first element that I want to talk about is for the movement. And in this case, the movement is really just the sound of the wings. And it's such a great story of how they created that sound. Doing something like wings is a bit tricky because essentially it's just the sound of wind passing by. But we have to try and figure out what the wind is moving across, because different surfaces create different sounds of wind, right? The wind running through rocks and across water is really different from the sound you might get from wind running through leaves in a forest. So in this case, we have these huge wings creating the sound of air movement. We could just wave things in front of the microphone, maybe a piece of rubber to get that wing sound, but what they did is way more interesting and fun than that. So for the fell beasts, the main element that they used for the wings was actually a cheese grater, if you can believe it. So one of those four-sided metal graters, they roped it up and stepped back, and one guy swung it around fast enough to get the sound of the wind going through it, and they recorded it. So of course, that's what I did. Such a funny thing that is just another reason why these movies are so great. The sound design team did whatever it took to get the sounds that they needed. Now, the other thing that we'll talk about in a minute is that they wanted that pulse, that heartbeat of the ring to be part of the fell beast wing sound. So we have an added layer for that as well. So let's run through the process of how I created that awesome sound for the fell beast's wings. Here is just the really, really simple sound of the cheese grater without anything added onto it. Awesome. Nothing special yet, but you can start to imagine a bit of a wing with that, hopefully. So the next thing that I did with it was to slow it down. Definitely sounds like too small of an animal at that speed, so I slowed it down a little bit. Let's listen to that. The next thing I did was to add a little bit of bass, a little bit more kind of low-end oomph to it. I'll play that same one that I just did, and then I'll play the added bass version after. Awesome, starting to get a little bit more of that weight that we need for this beast. The next thing that will really start to tie it all together is a bit of reverb, just to give it a little bit more kind of length and depth. So here's that added reverb. There we go. Now, for the finishing touch, let's see if we can add that heartbeat sound onto it. Here's just the clean sound of the heartbeat. Now we're going to do the same things because we want that kind of continuity between the sound. So I'll start by slowing this down. And now let's add a little bit more bass to it to really make it kind of hit a little harder. Awesome. Now finally we'll add that same little bit of reverb to it. And then lastly, we get to hear both of those elements, the wind through the wings and the heartbeat of the ring together. So there you go, that is our finished movement element, starting to sound pretty cool. So let's jump into the vocal element now. This is so funny also, but so awesome how they came up with these things for the movies. The vocal element of the fell beast is actually some yells, if you want to call them that, from a donkey. When you play around with it a little bit, it actually starts to sound pretty chilling, I must say, after working on some of this. So here's the original sound that I found for the donkey. So unfortunately I couldn't go out and record some actual donkeys for this, but I did find some online. So I had two different types there, and that I could play around with. So the next thing I did was to try and, again,